Hello and welcome to this ICMI20 video interview with me, Mike Buchanan, and Elizabeth Hobson, the founder and leader respectively of the political party Justice for Men and Boys and the Women Who Love Them. Our guest today is a hero to everyone in the global men's rights movement, Philip Davies MP. Now, Philip has been a huge fan of horse racing since he was a boy. And in his honour, I'm now going to change the image behind me to one of some bricklayers enjoying a day off work at the Epsom Derby.
You feel much more at home now.
Absolutely. Brilliant.
Well, they could be bricklayers. Philip has been the Conservative MP for Shipley in Yorkshire since 2005. In one recent general election, beating Sophie Walker, the leader of the Women's Equality Party, so decisively that she lost her deposit. That was a memorable day. Over the last 15 years, Philip has been the only elected politician in the English-speaking world to advocate on a regular basis for men and boys. He hosted the first debate on men's issues in the House of Commons to commemorate International Men's Day in 2015, despite the efforts of Jess Phillips, a Labour MP, to deny him the opportunity of that debate. He's hosted the debates ever since, and they've covered important men's issues, including suicide, domestic abuse, and male genital mutilation, MGM. He has publicly challenged and voted against feminist legislation such as recognition of the Istanbul Convention. He's a member of the Digital, Culture, Media and Sports Committee, where he's an outspoken critic of the BBC, the relentlessly left-wing and politically correct national broadcaster, which is funded by long-suffering licence fee payers. He's long been a key member of the Freedom Association and the campaign against political correctness. He spoke at the 2016 International Conference on Men's Issues in London, after which the Guardian newspaper sought to have him expelled from the party to no avail, as well as at the 2019 conference in Chicago. We're delighted to record a short interview with Philip today, after which we'll play a compilation of some of his most memorable appearances on video. Philip Davies's greatest hits, if you will. Philip, welcome.
Thank you very much. That's very kind, Mike.
So, Philip, if I might ask the first question, progressive, radical left-wing ideologies like feminism appear to be well established in many sectors, from health to education, charity, the media, etc., etc. Now, I assume that you have some hope that we can overcome that problem as a society, which is why you resist it in your work. But I wonder how much faith you have in our ability to overcome it.
I think you're certainly right in your analysis, Elizabeth. I think in politics, you've always got to be optimistic that what you believe in will eventually triumph. I mean, whether it does or not is a different matter. But if you don't have the belief that you can win the arguments and win the debate and effect change, then really it's at that point you shouldn't be in politics any longer. So I've always believed in the common sense of the British people. I think the public are always a long way ahead of politicians on most issues, and we've seen that time and time again. And obviously Brexit was the prime example of that, where the public were well ahead of politicians on that particular issue. And actually, in many respects, it's very difficult to think of any issue where politicians in Parliament are on the same page as the public opinion at large. I mean, politicians are amazingly out of touch with public opinion, and they tend to sort of try to appeal to each other and also to the sort of metropolitan elite in the media, the London-based media, and things like that. They want to get a good press from them. Whereas I'm not really interested in that. I'm interested in the British public. And I think that the British public are sick of the sort of politically correct brigade, small numbers, very vociferous, making changes to the country that they don't really like. In many respects, the public have been cowed into not speaking out against it because, of course, if you do, you're accused of being a sexist or racist or whatever it might be. But I still believe that the majority of the British people are sick to the back teeth of these sort of politically correct extremists, and that one day, sooner rather than later, there'll be a backlash against it, and that common sense will prevail. I really do believe that. The question is how long it will take, and that's the bit I don't know the answer to.
Philip, do you think your political colleagues, both MPs and peers, have become more understanding of men's and boys' issues since you were elected an MP in 2005? And when might we hope to see that translate into more politicians being publicly concerned with men's and boys' issues, regardless of the opposition from feminist politicians?
I think there is a greater understanding of the fact that men's issues are real and that they do exist, and that something needs to be done about them. The point I always made, and when I first applied for a debate in Parliament to coincide with International Men's Day, was that there was a difference between men raising issues and the raising of men's issues. They're two very different things. And, you know, obviously we're not short of the first, but we were often very short of the second. And I think that is changing, actually. I think there's a recognition amongst many MPs that the issues, you know, around male suicide in particular, or educational outcomes for particularly white working class boys, they're definitely much more on people's radar now. And actually, I think people are much more willing to speak out about them now than they were. I think before, you know, people sort of had some kind of misguided guilt complex about speaking out about some of these issues that affected men. I genuinely don't think there is that same embarrassment or shame in doing so now. And some of my colleagues are doing so. I mean, Ben Bradley, who's the MP for Mansfield since 2017, has been very, very vociferous and active in campaigning on educational outcomes for white working class boys. And he's done so very effectively. And I think, you know, anybody who looks at the data can see that the group of people who are most disadvantaged by our educational system, the ones that have the poorest outcomes, are white working class boys. And he's been very, very vociferous about that. So yeah, I think this is changing. I think that people are now much more willing to raise these issues in Parliament. People do contribute to the debate on International Men's Day to raise these issues. And so yeah, I think we've come an awful long way in a short space of time.
Philip, thank you very much, and thank you for your many years of advocating on behalf of men and boys. It's hugely appreciated in the movement around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Osborne, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity of being able to bring this debate to the House today. One of the starkest examples of just how politically correct this country has become is over the issue of women in the justice system, and more specifically for this debate, women in prison and in courts. Just about 5% of the prison population at any one time in recent history has been female, the other 95% male. Yet so much time, effort, concentration and browbeating has taken place over this very small number of women in prison. There are countless groups and organisations calling for this number to be reduced. There are far too many politicians, male as well as female, willing to trot out politically correct nonsense on the subject, repeating facts that don't bear any scrutiny at all. And there are far too many calls for something to be done, a problem that by anybody's standards it's hard to see exists based on the actual evidence. Let's just imagine for one moment that the male population in prison represented just 5% of the total, and that women made up the remaining 95% of the total. Would there be an outcry on behalf of these men at the expense of the women? Of course not. There's absolutely no chance on earth that this would happen. So why is there all of this concern over 5% of the prison population? How can normally thoughtful, intelligent people have taken such leave of their senses over this issue? I would suggest that the answer is simple. It's all about being politically correct, and not many people in public life like to challenge it. I do, Mrs Osborne, and today I want to take the opportunity to scotch some myths about all types of sentencing for women. And there are 5 myths in particular that I want to bust. There's an old political maxim that if you tell a lie often enough, people will believe it's true. And I can only conclude that this has happened on this particular issue. And the story for me, Mrs Osborne, begins really because I heard this particular lie so many times from people that women are more likely to be sent to prison than men, they're treated much more harshly by the courts. And I was taken in by it too. I presumed it was true because I'd heard it so often. I thought it must be true. And I thought it was an absolute outrage. And it prompted me, I was so outraged by this inequality in sentencing that I decided to do some research into it. And as many people know, I spend an awful lot of time researching matters to do with prisons and sentencing and justice. And I wanted to get to the bottom of why women were being treated so badly. So imagine my surprise when, having looked upon all the evidence, it wasn't that women are treated more harshly by courts when it comes to sentencing them. The absolutely unequivocal evidence is that, on the contrary, women are actually treated far, far more favourably by the courts when it comes to sentencing than men. And there are 5 particular myths that I want to expose today. The first myth is quite a simple one. The myth is that women are very likely to be sent to prison and are more likely than men to be given a custodial sentence. Mrs Osborne, this is quite simply untrue. Everyone I've spoken to who is involved with the justice system confirms anecdotally that this is not the case. But let's not just take their word for it, let's look at the facts. I asked the House of Commons Library to provide the evidence that more women were being sent to prison than men, as I'd been told was the case. Not only did they not provide this information, they confirmed that the exact opposite is in fact true. The Library said, and I quote, "The published statistics show that a higher proportion of men are given a sentence of immediate custody than women, irrespective of age of offender, juveniles, young adults or adult, and the type of court, magistrates or crown. This has been the case in each year between 1999 and 2009, for which the figures they looked at. For each offence group, a higher proportion of males are sentenced to custody than females. In 2009, 58% of male offenders who entered a guilty plea for an indictable offence were given an immediate custodial sentence, compared to just 34% of women. For each offence group, of course I'll give way.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. Could he clarify whether the information he received from the House of Commons Library also looked at statistics by type of offence?
Yes, absolutely. They look at every category of offence. And for every single category of offence, women are less likely to be sent to prison than men. I'll give way.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman. I congratulate him on this important debate, and I hope that at the end of it we certainly will have made sure that we're not peddling myths but facts. Would he like to comment on the fact that whilst 70% of men are in prison for a non-violent offence, 81% of women are? Doesn't that suggest that while some statistics may favour women, that one most certainly doesn't?
No, it certainly doesn't mean that at all. The figures that the honourable lady quotes, and that these groups are often fond of quoting, actually goes to show the exact opposite of what they think it shows. It actually goes to show that actually women are treated more favourably by the courts than men. But I'll give the detail to her. If she'll let me continue with the speech, it will become self-evident to her, I hope. And if she still has any remaining queries towards the end, I'll happily give way to her again, if these figures don't make any sense. But I'm sure even to the honourable lady these figures will make perfect sense. I will continue with the quote from the House of Commons Library, if I may, Mrs Osborne.
Right, Philip. An application about International Men's Day.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Chairman. My pitch is a fairly straightforward one, in the sense that every year since I can remember, certainly since I've been a member of this House, which is 10 years now, we've had an annual debate, and in the last few years, this committee has granted one. In fact, I think I was on the committee when it did grant the debate for International Women's Day. And that's been held every single year. And so I thought that in the spirit of gender equality, it would only be right to have a debate to commemorate International Men's Day, which conveniently falls on Thursday the 19th of November, which is a date when you may or may not have some time to allocate, so it will be very fitting. Because, of course, not only do we have International Women's Day, we also have women and equality questions every month in the Chamber, which we don't have for men. So the opportunity for men to raise issues that are important to them is very limited. And just to give you a flavour, Mr. Chairman, of the type of things that may come up and which will be part of International Men's Day, I'm not entirely sure why it's so humorous, but to discuss issues such as men's shorter life expectancy, wider male health issues, many of which go unreported through embarrassment of men to sort of go along and talk about these things, the high suicide rate amongst men, the propensity for violence against men. There's many male victims of domestic violence, again as something that goes very much unreported because of lots of embarrassment about it, the underachievement of boys in education compared to girls, the issues around father-child relationships, and often the way that fathers sometimes feel they don't get a fair crack of the whip in terms of custody of their children and things like that. These are all issues that affect an awful lot of people around the country, whether people agree with some people's views or not. I think it's important that the House of Commons debates these issues. I think people can recognise that they are all very real issues for many people in the country, and so in the spirit of gender equality, given that we have the debate each year on International Women's Day, which I suspect will continue under this committee, I thought it would only be fair that we had an opportunity to debate these issues under the flag of International Men's Day, which is this year on Thursday the 19th of November.
Thank you very much. Questions? Jess?
You have to excuse me for laughing, that the idea that men don't have the opportunity to ask questions in this place is a frankly laughable thing. As I say, as the only woman on this committee, it seems like every day to me is.
Well, I wasn't making, with respect, I wasn't making that point. I wasn't making the point that men don't have an opportunity to ask. I was about men's issues. There's a very big difference between men raising issues and the raising of men's issues.
But one could raise men's issues in any single one of the question sessions. So your men's health, absolutely. So prostate cancer, that could be raised in men's questions, couldn't it?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I very much look forward to these arguments being deployed when we come to consider a debate on International Women's Day, because exactly the same arguments could be raised for International Women's Day, that women's health issues, that equality issues could be raised in women and equality questions in other forms. So all I ask is for an equal crack of the whip, that if those issues can be raised without having a debate on International Men's Day, then obviously the same issues can apply for when it comes to International Women's Day, but those arguments have never won the day before this committee.
I just think that it's worth pointing out the idea that this chamber, that these houses, both of them, in any way reflect gender equality is to me a frankly laughable thing. And so in the fight for equality, I'm not sure the men on this list necessarily have that much to fight for.
Bob, please.
Yeah, I can empathise with a lot of the issues that you're concerned about. I mean, I think many people would say that people don't talk about testicular cancer or prostate cancer for fear of embarrassment. So that's quite clearly an issue that needs a lot more public debate. My concern is the balance of debate on the list of potential speakers.
All men.
The fact that they're all men doesn't matter so much. What does matter is that there doesn't seem to be a preponderance of people from across the House, they seem to be concentrated from the Conservative Party.
I don't care about men's issues. It's that I'm hoping for parity myself.
Hear, hear.
I absolutely care about men's issues. And when I've got parity, and when women in these buildings have parity, you can have your debate.
Oh, Mr. Chairman, if I can just make the point,
and that will take an awfully long time.
I'm not requesting a debate on representation within the House of Commons. I'm asking for debates on men's issues, and the list of issues I gave earlier, I would like to think people can recognise are genuine issues and actually are very, very rarely debated in the House of Commons. Very rarely debated in the House of Commons.
Right. Well, thank you very much for it. Thank you very much indeed.
In my maiden speech that I would campaign hard against the blight of political correctness, which is doing so much damage to our country. 10 years have passed, and I'm still here fighting this battle. Some of the most ludicrous cases of political correctness have reduced, but the more entrenched ones are still well and truly thriving. And one of the main areas where we see the pernicious effects of political correctness is when it comes to the treatment of men and women. And I heard about International Men's Day and decided that it was only right, given that we have a debate each year on International Women's Day, in the interests of gender parity, to try to appeal for time to be given for this debate to commemorate this day. The aims of International Men's Day are admirable. They are to promote positive male role models, not just movie stars and sportsmen, but everyday working class men who are living decent, honest lives, to celebrate men's positive contributions to society, community, family, marriage, childcare and to the environment, to focus on men's health and well-being, social, emotional, physical and spiritual, to highlight discrimination against men in areas of social services, social attitudes and expectations and the law, and to improve gender relations and promote gender equality, and finally to create a safer, better world where people can be safe and grow to reach their full potentials. Of course I will.
Can I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and can I commend him for securing this as an important debate? And he's just outlined the importance of International Men's Day. Would he not share my disappointment that this debate should be held on the floor of the House of Commons rather than in the second chamber in Westminster Hall?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for coming to the debate and also for making that point. And yes, I would have preferred the debate to be in the main chamber, especially given as International Women's Day debate is held there too. But I'm grateful that we've got an opportunity to raise these issues, which we've never done before. So it would be churlish for me to be too critical, given that we've got the time for this debate today. But I want today to be the day that we in this House start to deal with some of the forgotten men's issues and realise why the political correctness which underpins issues relating to the differing treatment of the sexes can be damaging to men. Now, this might sound odd for someone leading a debate on International Men's Day, but in many respects, Mr. Gates, I would rather we did not have to be here to have this debate. Because when you think about it, in so many ways, considering men and women separately, as if they live lives in complete isolation to each other, is ridiculous. Neither group is isolated. Both sexes have mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers, uncles and aunts, grandmothers and grandfathers, sons and daughters, husbands and wives, boyfriends and girlfriends. So for every woman there are related male parties and therefore a vested interest in men's issues. The problem is that in virtually everything we do in this House and debate in this House seems to start with the premise that everything is biased against women and something must be done about it. Never an appreciation that men's issues can be just as important and that men can be just as badly treated in certain areas as women. My honourable friend, the member for Belfast East, supported my request for a debate, and I know he is very sorry that he unfortunately could not be here today to join in. But had he been here, no doubt he would have shared the fact that last year Belfast City Council hosted its first event to mark International Men's Day. This was, I understand, held in Belfast Castle, opened by the First Minister and the Lord Mayor of Belfast, Nicola Mallon, following a proposal by Alderman Ruth Patterson. It seems our Ulster friends had this event appreciating that there are some specifically male issues that should be addressed with both sexes involved. And I want to be very clear, I don't believe that there is actually an issue between men and women. I think that often the problems are stirred up by those who might be described as militant feminists and the politically correct males who sometimes pander to it.
Mike, thank you very much indeed for that kind introduction. It's nice to be speaking to an audience where I'm relatively popular. Certainly doesn't happen in the House of Commons very often. I'm here today to talk about the justice gender gap. Just recently, there was an article in the Daily Express discussing the story developing in the Archers over the character Helen Titchener. The headline was, "We wanted to represent gender injustice. The Archer's editor defends Helen's imprisonment." Now, I'm not someone who has followed the Archers at all, but I do know that if they think they're doing a service representing gender injustice, then they've got it all wrong. Despite what the lovies at the BBC would have you believe, the very clear gender injustice is one that actually favours women over men, as I will go on to demonstrate today. I want to be very clear that I don't believe that there is actually an issue between men and women. I think the problem is being stirred up by those who could be described as militant feminists and the politically correct males who pander to this nonsense. It seems to me that this has led to an equality, but only when it suits a gender, that applies to women. The drive for women to have so-called equality on all the things that suit the politically correct agenda, but not on the things that don't, is of increasing concern to me. For example, we hear plenty about increasing the numbers of women on company boards and female representation in Parliament. However, there's a deafening silence when it comes to increasing the number of men who have custody of their children or who have careers as midwives. In fact, generally there seems to be a deafening silence on all the benefits women have compared to men. In this day and age, the feminist zealots really do want women to have their cake and eat it. They fight for their version of equality on all the things that suit women, but are very quick to point out that women need special protections and treatment on other things. One simple example to illustrate this point is the issue of prison uniforms. Men in prison on the basic regime have to wear a prison uniform. Women in prison do not. How, I have asked on several occasions, can this be fair? Where's the equality in that? I'll come on to the treatment of men and women in our justice system in detail, but this issue is about as clear as it can get. We have a completely different policy simply based on the sex of the prisoner. This is a bill to require the United Kingdom to ratify the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, the Istanbul Convention, and for connected purposes. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, I don't expect to find much support in this House for some of what I want to put on the record today, although that's quite normal in my experience, but I expect that many people outside of this House are more likely to agree, and we only have to look at the EU referendum to see how out of touch this House is with majority opinion across the country. And this is a typical Friday bill, if I might be able to say that. It's basically comes with a worthy sentiment. You know, who can possibly be against trying to stop violence against women? Nobody. I'm not aware of anybody who wants to argue that people should be violent towards women and girls. Of course not. And so, because the title of the bill has about combating violence against women, then it presumes that if as long as you support that premise, then you must support this particular bill. And therefore, if you oppose this bill, it means that you must be in favour, as it follows, of violence against women and children. Now, that's the kind of level of debate I would expect from the morons on Twitter, Mr Deputy Speaker, but I still live in hope that we might actually have better quality debate than that in this House, although my experience is that it doesn't actually get much better normally. But I'm going to live in hope and try again that we can actually have a sensible debate about these matters rather than the level of debate that we get used to on social media. Now, I have a fundamental objection to the whole premise that we only need to deal with violence against women. No. It was worth thinking about for a few seconds. I'm sure the Honourable Lady would appreciate.
If she comes back to me later, I may well oblige her later. But I couldn't resist that temptation. I'll give way to the.
Thank you, and I really do appreciate the tone that he's taking and recognising the seriousness. But I would point out to him that there are two parts to the title: combating violence against women and domestic violence. It doesn't say if the domestic violence is against men, women, or children.
Come on to that. I'm very grateful to the honourable lady for highlighting that, but I'm going to come on to that because, as she rightly says, and as I tried to illustrate when I started, there are two separate elements to this, and I want to do both of them justice, if I may. I can't really believe this needs saying, to be honest, but it's rather, I think it's so discriminatory and sexist to say that we should only be focusing on violence against women. And if this was the other way round, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there would be an absolute outcry from people in this House, and rightly so. And rightly so, there will be an absolute outcry about it. Now, I don't take the view that violence against women and girls is somehow worse than violence against men and boys. As far as I'm concerned, all violence is unacceptable, and all violence against the person should be punished by law. Both men and women are victims, and both are perpetrators of these crimes. I believe in true equality and want people to be treated equally when they are a victim of crime and when they're a perpetrator of crime.
Will my honourable friend keep going?
Yes, I will.
He's making a characteristically passionate speech, but would you not want to acknowledge that over the last 20 years, half of the victims of murder who are women are from family members? Only 6% of males who've been murdered are from family members. That is quite a significant discrepancy, and it needs to be acknowledged in this House.
Well, I will come on to the discrepancy between male and female, the levels of violence against men and the levels of violence against women. I'll come on to that in due course, Mr. Deputy Speaker, if I may, because it's a point that's very much worth highlighting. So I believe in true equality and want people to be treated equally. At the moment, whether people like it or not, men are treated more harshly than women in the criminal justice system, certainly when it comes to sentencing, and I know that's an inconvenient truth for many people, but it is the truth nevertheless. And on top of that, and this is where it relates to my honourable friend's point, all the evidence shows that men are more likely to be a victim of violent crime than women in this country.
So could you tell me what the gender, disability and race pay gaps are in your organisation?
Not off the top of my head, but we're happy to provide the information to you separately afterwards. I would just like.
Well, if this is such a priority for the to eliminate these pay gaps across the country, and that you're striving to get all these organisations to take this seriously, you'd think that you would at least know what yours was off the top. I mean, you'd think that this was such a priority. The first thing you'd be doing is keeping a track on exactly what's happening in your own organisation, rather than having a sort of a.
One of the reasons that we're not.
You should know these figures for your own organisation off by heart. Surely, if it's that important.
We know. So let me answer the question. I think we know that we have perhaps a small pay gap. I don't know the answer, but I think I would pray and aid the fact that we are actually going through a huge reorganisation at the moment, and in relation to that reorganisation, we're hoping to eliminate any pay gap whatsoever. And as Rebecca has said, we will, once that new operating model has been implemented, provide you with full details. But we should be an exemplar organisation. I completely agree with you. And I think we'd be unique if there wasn't a pay gap, but I would hope that we could eliminate it as much as possible.
Well, let me help you out.
Okay.
I mean, I've got the last figures for which I have, which are for March 2015. So I appreciate that we're a bit out of date with the last figures that seem to be available that I've got. But you had a gender pay gap of 1.2% for full-time workers and 6.8% for part-time workers. You had a 13.3% pay gap for disabled people, so you were paying non-disabled people more than you were paying disabled staff. And you had an 8.8% pay gap on race. So my point is, if an organisation like yours, which has got as its top priority to stamp out these pay gaps, if your organisation can't eliminate these pay gaps, how on earth can we expect every other organisation in the country and every other employer in the country to have eliminated these pay gaps?
Can I just come back to you on that? And thank you very much. We do actually know corporately, know those figures and have looked at them, despite the fact that I didn't know them off by heart. We are aware, obviously, of those gaps, and we have undertaken an audit, and we understand the reasons for those. And everybody here, obviously, is aware that the causes for pay gaps are complex. We are undertaking some very significant research in this area, and we will be publishing that shortly, looking at what we found out to be sort of broader causation of pay gaps generally. And what will make this work unique is that actually we are looking at it from a perspective of race and disability as well as gender.
So what are the reasons for these pay gaps in your organisation?
Well, on a detailed basis, I'm very happy to provide that information to you separately. I wouldn't like to go into details at this point that's going to look at individual cases. That doesn't feel appropriate. But the work that we are doing is going to look at bringing about practical action to achieve change in that place, and that is an important part of our work going forward.
And just the other thing on this is that the figures that you provided in the past to me when I've asked for these figures have been the mean earnings. I spoke to the Office of National Statistics about the gender pay gap, and they produce the figures mean and median, but think that median, the ONS think median is much more a much more sensible measure than mean. So why do you produce them in mean when the ONS think that the most meaningful figure is median?
I have to say that predates my appointment. I think those are very good challenges which I will take away and look at. I think, as I said right at the start, we are going through a staff reorganisation. Eliminating the pay gap has been one of our considerations, and we clearly need to do better, but we need to be, as I said, an exemplar organisation and eradicate the gap where we can.
Did something happen to you? Any experiences in your life?
No, it's nothing to do with my own personal experience. Nothing at all. No, I mean, I like standing up for unfashionable causes. I mean, any old fool can stand up and argue for things that everybody else is standing up for, and I like to stand up for things that people shy away from. And if I think there's something that's there's an injustice, then I like to speak out. And so I just thought it was absolutely appalling that we were going to write into the statute book that actually violence against women was more important than violence against men. And I can't accept that. No, exactly. I mean, the thing was that they talked about all these other countries that had ratified it, and that's why we should. But not one of the people who advocated it had actually taken the effort to find out what happened in those other countries that had ratified. I was literally the only MP who wrote to every single ambassador of the countries who had ratified it and asked them for the figures. You'd think, wouldn't you, before you in business. If somebody does something and you want to decide whether you should do it too, the first thing you do is say, well, what impact did it have? Did it have a good impact or did it have a bad impact? In politics, that's an irrelevance. And I was the only one who actually bothered to find out, did this make any difference? And the fact of the matter was that quite clearly, if you look at the figures, ratifying the Istanbul Convention doesn't make a blind bit of difference to levels of violence against women or girls. In fact, in some countries like Austria, the violence went through the roof after they ratified the convention. I'm not saying it's because they ratified it, but clearly it makes no difference.
Yeah,
and it's obvious, isn't it? I mean, if you're concerned about men being violent towards women, particularly in the context of domestic violence, I mean, can you imagine how many men who are about to beat up their wife or partner or whatever it is would say, hold on a minute, I'm not going to do that because I think, if I'm not mistaken, that we've just signed the Istanbul Convention. I mean, it's easier, isn't it? I mean, I must be a fool, really, to sort of stand up and say these things. My life would be much easier if I just sort of sat and didn't say anything and let them just carry on with it and you know, it would make my life a lot easier, wouldn't it? And that's what everyone else thinks. They think, well, why would I? Why bother? You know, I'll just anything for an easy life. Look, my great grandma was a suffragette. Mm-hmm. My grandma was called Sylvia after Sylvia Pankhurst. Mm-hmm. You know, so I think for lots of people, where feminism started was in a noble pursuit for genuine equality. Mm-hmm. And there's no doubt in my mind that in the past women have been discriminated against in certain areas, and that's now, to me, the solution is to remove the discrimination. Unfortunately, for many sort of modern day feminism, it's about reversing the discrimination, and that's where the problem is. So the thing is, when you say, well, you know, do you believe in feminism? It's a difficult question to answer, because it depends. You get different people in the room, they'll all have different versions of what that means. For some people, that genuinely means gender equality. Those people who sort of call themselves feminists are much more militant in their feminism, in a way that's completely at odds with the vast majority of the public and the vast majority of women.
I also want to touch on male circumcision, Mr. Bailey. Male genital mutilation. According to a barrister's opinion, carrying out circumcision on males where there is no medical need, non-therapeutic circumcision, is a crime under the Offences Against the Person Act 1861, being at least actual bodily harm, if not grievous bodily harm. In 1983, Lord Hailsham, the then Lord Chancellor, said of female genital mutilation, in the case of a minor under the age of 18, there is no possibility that consent is any defence at all. A minor under the age of 16 is not able to consent to the commission upon her of a criminal assault. Neither parental consent nor the consent of the minor would be any defence at all. And if the parents did such a thing, or instigated such a thing, or participated in such a thing, it would only render them liable to criminal penalties too. When I put it to the government in 2016 that female genital mutilation was already illegal before specific laws were introduced on the subject, they agreed that it was. When I then put the position regarding boys to them, they took a different line. They quoted Sir James Mumby as the President of the Family Division of the High Court in a case in January 2015 as saying, whereas it can never be reasonable parenting to inflict any form of FGM on a child, the position is quite different with male circumcision. Society and the law, including family law, are prepared to tolerate non-therapeutic male circumcision performed for religious or even for purely cultural or conventional reasons, while no longer being willing to tolerate FGM in any of its forms. As the former barrister I mentioned earlier also said, it would require a parliamentary override for male circumcision to be legal, and that has never existed. No exemptions to the law of the land are permissible for religious or cultural reasons. The Ministry of Justice went on to say that there was no doubt that female genital mutilation could have a physical and psychological impact on women. They also said that some girls die as a result of the procedure. Absolutely right, too, Mr. Bailey. I don't pretend to be an expert in this field, but I do believe that boys have been reported to have died too following a circumcision, and I have also seen accounts of the physical and psychological impact on men. I understand that the position of the NHS is that the risks associated with routine circumcision, such as infection and excessive bleeding, outweigh any potential benefits. I am mentioning all of this as I think it is something that should be on the record, not least because of the very different approach to male and female genital mutilation. The government said back in 2016 that they had no current plans to change the law in relation to male circumcision. Given everything I've said, there may be no need to change the law at all to bring about a change in male circumcisions, but I'll be particularly interested to hear from the Minister on this point.
With great interest. And he mentioned the very, very complex issues of female genital mutilation and male circumcision. I I very much understand why he's raised it. Sorry, female genital mutilation is illegal, and it does the range of ways in which a little girl can be mutilated are frankly horrific. But I take the point he has raised about male circumcision, and if I may, I'm going to consider it and write to him on that. Because I wouldn't wish to address such an important matter on the fly. And I'm going to finish, Mr. Bailey, by saying that my humble friend for Shipley concluded his speech by wishing that we could all live together equally in happiness, and I think we can all agree with that.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.
Okay, well, we're here today in front of Portcullis House, the high security modern building near the Houses of Parliament, where many MPs, including Philip Davies, have their offices, and where much of the business of Parliament actually takes place. We've been supporters of Philip because of his advocacy for men and boys over many years, especially since 2015, when he overcame the attempt by Jess Phillips on the Backbench Business Committee to deny him the opportunity to host the first ever debate on men's issues in Parliament on International Men's Day that year. There's a link to the video of Jess Phillips' infamous attempt on that committee in the description box.
In 2016, Philip gave a well-received talk at our second international conference on men's issues in London, which pleasingly later had journalists at The Guardian foaming at the mouth in a doomed effort to get Theresa May to withdraw the Conservative whip from him. He's hosted or contributed to all 3 International Men's Day debates since 2016, including the one he hosted last Thursday, in which he made a groundbreaking statement concerning male genital mutilation and female genital mutilation. We'll be talking to him about that and other important issues.
Philip, thank you so much for giving us some of your time today. I'd like to start by putting on the record our appreciation for your advocacy for men and boys over the years, as well as the appreciation of the men's rights movement internationally. You're pretty well the only parliamentarian in the world who ever talked publicly about the many human rights abuses that men and boys suffer. I wonder if you could start with your statement about male genital mutilation and female genital mutilation in your introduction to the International Men's Day debate last Thursday. We believe this to be the first time not only that the term male genital mutilation has gone into Hansard, but also the issue of the illegality of it. Can you tell us what reaction you had from other MPs after the debate for raising the issue?
I didn't really have any reaction, to be perfectly honest, which was quite striking in many respects. And I was actually quite surprised that I actually thought the minister was actually quite helpful. She didn't dismiss the issue out of hand and say it wasn't an issue. She sort of said she'd look into it and get back to me. So I'm waiting for her to look into it and get back to me, to be perfectly honest.
Okay.
So I was surprised it wasn't dismissed as a non-issue, and I thought that was quite interesting.
How many times have you been in breach of the Equality Act at the EHRC?
Well, we haven't had any breaches of the Equality Act recently, and as far as I'm aware, in the last couple of years we haven't even had so much as a grievance or a complaint. We've had employment tribunal cases which have largely been about redundancy. There haven't been breaches of the Equality Act, and certainly while I've been at the Commission there have been no breaches.
Since you've been at the Commission there's been no breaches?
We've not.
So you were in the Commission in 2014, is that right?
Yes.
And you're saying there's been no breaches?
We've lost no equality tribunal cases in that point, in that time.
I haven't lost any equality.
Sorry, employment tribunal cases.
Yes, we haven't lost any cases. But you see, when David, you were saying you want to make it as easy as possible for people individuals to be able to pursue their things, You might not have lost any, but you've forced people to go to employment tribunals in your time and then settled at the employment tribunal, haven't you?
The employment tribunal cases that have taken place during that time have not been in relation to breaches of the Equality Act.
Disability? Is that not a breach of the Equality Act?
There have been redundancy-based issues.
This was about disability. I mean, you actually sent this to the committee. It was about complaints by staff for race, sex or disability discrimination at the Commission. This is information you sent to the committee when we asked for it at previous evidence sessions. It's your stuff that you sent to the committee, Annex C. And so you're the ones who highlighted these cases. This was disability, discrimination, that's under the Equality Act, went to an employment tribunal, was settled. That's not making it as easy as possible for people to pursue their complaint, is it? Forcing them to go to an employment tribunal before you actually acknowledge that something went wrong and settle the case.
Can I add to what Rebecca was saying? Because actually I think it's really important that we see this in the context in which Rebecca set it out, which is that these were reorganisations to ensure that the Commission was best placed to be able to meet its statutory obligations. And I think it is correct, if that's the evidence that we've submitted previously, that in the context of those reorganisations, when employment tribunal claims have been made, that various assertions in relation to breaches might have been made, but those assertions were within that sort of context. And yes, you're right, those matters were resolved by agreement.
Yeah, well, this was disability. This wasn't redundancy. This was disability discrimination, where somebody had to go to an employment tribunal, and you settled at the employment tribunal. But that's not what I'm saying. Is you've just said earlier, David, that you're a big believer that we've got to make it as easy as possible for people and all the rest of it. And yet you, that's supposed to be at the vanguard of actually doing this, are actually with your own employees making them go to an employment tribunal before you will settle the case. That's not somebody that I would see as being a best practice organisation, is it?
I don't necessarily see the two as inconsistent, because in the context well, no, I don't, with the greatest of respect, because I think that obviously what we need to do is to make it as easy for people as possible to bring claims and to assert their rights in relation to the equality legislation, but equally within the context of a reorganisation, even when it happens on our own turf, that in that context sometimes people do make assertions in relation to particular challenges, including in relation to the Equality Act. So I'm confident that we treated those people well. We didn't make it difficult for them to bring those claims, but we did agree consensually that they would not proceed with them.
Well, you didn't treat them well. You shouldn't have had to settle a claim for disability discrimination, would you? I mean,
we can't go into the individual cases, but I would suggest that...
it's a pretty lamentable record, isn't it? Since the Equality Act came into being, the EHRC, not always under your watch, I accept, but it's had a pretty lamentable record of actually discrimination cases, hasn't it?
I think historically...
Sex maternity, settled at an employment tribunal. Race, settled at an employment tribunal. Disability, informally resolved. Race, partially upheld. Employment tribunal, outcome unknown. That's a bizarre one. Disability, partially upheld. Disability, settled. Sex discrimination, upheld. Disability discrimination, settled. Sex equal pay, upheld. I mean, it's a pretty lamentable record for the organisation that's supposed to be going around the country.
Well, actually, and then Rebecca can respond. I think it's really important to say that many of the matters that you just referred to, as Rebecca said earlier on, are very historical. On our watch, there were two reorganisations which were introduced as a result of cuts, and us endeavouring to streamline the organisation to be more impactful, as we've presented to the committee historically. We can never make it... we can't legislate for how our staff respond to those particular situations, and they do, unfortunately, make assertions and have made assertions as part of the claims that they have brought. But I take it very seriously. We haven't done anything to make it difficult for those individuals to assert their claims, but actually many lawyers will know that in relation to those reorganisations, many claims are asserted. I'm not saying that they weren't valid, but actually we take them very seriously and do our best to resolve them.
Or would you accept that if you're going to go around taking other people to task, you've got to raise your own game a bit first in your own organisation? Sure.
I'm confident that we have raised our game and that those are historical matters. But Rebecca, was there anything
I
else?
think you pretty much said what I was going to say, but we do take it very seriously. And in relation to all the matters that happened on mine and David's watch, we were scrupulous about going over the process and ensuring that fairness had been administered both at an operational level, and obviously there were appeals to the board which were considered very seriously. And we were absolutely clear that we had to follow best practice.
I, along with others I'm sure, think that enough is enough. To save future generations of children from having non-existent relationships with their fathers for no reason other than the whim of their mother, with all the terrible consequences that entails for the fathers and the children, something needs to be done. In Britain, we currently have a domestic abuse bill going through Parliament. I'm going to try to table an amendment to this bill when it comes before the House of Commons to amend the definition of domestic abuse. I want the definition of domestic abuse to include cases where one parent deliberately denies the other parent contact for no good reason at all.
Now, I want to make points that I don't think anyone else will make, Madam Deputy Speaker, which is my role often in these debates. And what I want to try and stop is, when there's been all this sort of consensus, is the idea that we've had through this debate that domestic violence is a gender-based crime. It is not, and we will be doing a huge disservice if we were to run away with that idea and make this piece of legislation work only on that basis. Men are perpetrators of domestic violence. Men are victims of domestic violence. Women are perpetrators of domestic violence. Women are victims of domestic violence. I'm going to go through the figures in a second to show why it isn't gender-based. And we in this House have a duty to treat everybody equally before the law. And I hope that it doesn't matter whether the perpetrator is a man or a woman, they should face the full rigour of the law, and whether the victim's a man or a woman, they should have exactly the same safeguards by this House. And I hope that that's what this legislation will do, and I don't want to hear any ideas that it shouldn't be like that. And just for the record for this, the official figures, the last figures for which are available, show that you are 1.5 times more likely to be a female victim of domestic violence in a lesbian relationship than in a heterosexual relationship. We should not be leaving behind those victims of domestic violence by running away with the idea that it's gender-based. Men are just as likely, 5.1% of men reported being victims of a non-sexual partner abuse with a male partner, which is exactly the same level as women have with a male partner. Men are just as likely to abuse a male partner as they are a female partner. So let's not say this isn't gender-based violence. This is unacceptable violence by all sorts of people, and we should treat them all equally before the law. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Can I thank my honourable friend for giving way? He needs to accept the facts that women are more affected by domestic violence than any other group. Would he not agree with the recommendation of the Joint Committee that rather than putting it on the face of the bill, perhaps for some of the reasons that he's talking about, but that we actually take the approach the government has accepted, that we have statutory guidance to make sure that those who are commissioning services are really clear of the need to reflect the needs of women in the services they provide?
Well, I want all victims to get the services that they need. We've just been hearing on our Women and Equality Select Committee the instances, the male victims of domestic violence. We heard very moving accounts of that recently. We all want to make sure that they get the services that they require too. This isn't about either or. I want to see everybody who is a victim of domestic violence get the treatment and support that they need. And I don't care whether that's a man or a woman, and neither should we in this House. We should want to provide those facilities and services for everybody, whether whether that's someone who's in a majority category or a minority category is irrelevant. There are two things, Madam Deputy Speaker, having got that on the record, there are two things that I would like, there's much in this bill that I support, and there's some things that I would like to see added to it. And I just want to mention the two things in the time available that I would like to see added to it. One of the things that I've been increasingly troubled by in recent years is the levels of parental alienation, where one parent tries to turn the other parent against the children against the other parents. They use the child as a weapon in their dispute. And this is a growing phenomenon that I certainly see in my surgeries, but also which is well documented. Now, quite clearly, in some cases, particularly where there is domestic violence taking place, it's quite right that the parent is removed from the family and the whole family. And I'm a hardliner on crime, as most people, I think, know, and I would treat perpetrators of domestic violence much more severely in the courts than they are at the moment. But I think that where there is no good reason for a parent to remove the contact of that child from the other parent, I think that parental alienation should in itself be seen as a form of domestic abuse. Because one thing that has come out during this debate, quite rightly, is that the people who are the biggest victims of domestic abuse often are the children. And I think that when a child is deliberately turned against another of the other parent for no good reason, that should be included in the definition of domestic abuse. The other thing that I think should be included, and I hope that the Minister will consider this, I'm surprised the SNP don't think that that's a particular problem, but that's a matter for them to explain. They ought to meet some parents who suffer from parental alienation. They might realise what a massive issue it is for those. It often leads to suicide amongst people as well, which they ought to think about, those people. The other thing is, when people make a false allegation of domestic abuse, which is also a very, very serious thing, I think the government should consider that also to be a form of domestic abuse in this relationship, in this legislation, because that is one of the most terrible things that somebody could be wrongly accused of. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I've tabled 26 amendments to the bill, so I've got about 10 seconds per amendment. I'd like to put on record my thanks to the Minister for her consideration of my amendments. We may not have ended up in total agreement on them, but I do appreciate the time she spent engaging with me on them. My amendments are simply about trying to make sure we protect all victims of domestic abuse. And I've had many, many conversations with men and women on this subject, agreeing wholeheartedly with what I'm trying to achieve. I think most people understand that both men and women can be and are victims of domestic abuse, and men and women can be and are perpetrators of domestic abuse. There are those who are seeking to claim that domestic violence is a gendered crime, i.e. that it is a crime done by men to women. Not only is this insulting to the male victims of domestic violence and ignores gay and lesbian victims of domestic abuse too, it's also utter rubbish. For example, a woman in a lesbian relationship, according to the official figures, is 1.5 times more likely to be a victim of domestic abuse from her partner than a woman in a heterosexual relationship. 2/3 of victims of domestic abuse are women and 1/3 are men, according to the Office of National Statistics. As it happens, 2/3 of people who are murdered are men, 2/3 of people who take their own life are men. Does anybody seriously want to stand up and say that we should ignore the 1/3 of women who are victims of murder or take their own life simply because they're in a minority? Of course not. And the same shouldn't apply when it comes to domestic violence too. Being a male victim of domestic violence
should not be less important or more important than being a female victim. Of course I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I'm listening very carefully to his amendments, and also I read them through very carefully. I'm not clear, though, which aspect of the bill he's disagreeing with, because, of course, this bill is covering every victim of domestic violence. So what changes does he want to see on the face of the bill?
Well, my honourable friend makes a fair point, but unfortunately it's not actually quite as it seems. There are references into the bill that the government, it says in the bill that government should take note of the fact and that services should be provided on the basis that women are more likely to be a victim than a man. It should be irrelevant. It doesn't matter whether the victim is a male or a female. It's completely irrelevant, and we should take out any kind of that kind of reference in the bill. The bill should be gender neutral. That's the point I'm trying to make. In the rest of the time allowed, Mr Deputy Speaker, I want to particularly focus on my Amendment 24, which is about classing parental alienation as domestic abuse, and also where a parent deliberately prevents the other parent from having contact with their child or children for no good reason. There are thousands of mums and dads, hundreds of thousands of mums and dads, grandmas and granddads who don't have any relationship with their children at all, simply because one parent has deliberately and for no good reason turned their child against the other parent. I think they'll find it quite extraordinary that all the main political parties are trying to block parental alienation being on the face of the bill as a criminal offence as domestic abuse. Parliament is failing those people, but I will keep speaking up for them. Yeah. This is simply cruel, not just for the parent deprived of access and the grandparents deprived of access, but for the children too. Yeah. And it should be quite clearly classed as domestic abuse if it is done without any good reason at all. I would like to say that I'm very grateful to the Minister for including parental alienation and preventing contact with children as examples of domestic abuse in the recently released draft of the statutory guidance which goes alongside this bill. I would have liked to have seen this in the bill itself, but I do believe that this is a momentous development, as it means that when considering domestic abuse, parental alienation and preventing contact are now specific examples that the government have highlighted in their guidance. Those individuals, including those men and women who have written to me with their distressing personal experiences, who are clearly suffering now, have a message from the government that what they are experiencing is clearly abuse. And I very much hope that this will be of significant comfort to those who currently feel completely helpless in these situations. With regard to the other amendments I've taken, I just want to highlight one in particular in the time I've got left, Mr Deputy Speaker, which is about lie detector tests, which haven't come up in the rest of the debate. My Amendment 26 would remove the use of lie detector tests. I'm on the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee that did an inquiry into the Jeremy Kyle show. Many people in this House reviled Jeremy Kyle because he was using lie detector tests on his programme, and people were pointing out that they are not reliable, that they come up with dodgy results. It seems extraordinary that the same people who were pointing out that it was outrageous for Jeremy Kyle to use lie detector tests in an entertainment programme because they weren't reliable would support using lie detector tests in something as serious as this, when clearly those tests are still just as unreliable as they were in his case. So I would like to see the evidence that says that these tests are accurate and justifies their use, which will presumably exonerate Jeremy Kyle, by the way, Mr Deputy Speaker, or otherwise we should not be touching them with a barge pole, and I look forward to hearing the evidence that the government have got to support the use of lie detector tests. But the main important message for me tonight, Mr Deputy Speaker, is that parental alienation is and should be domestic abuse.